I don't know where you can remember back to when we were in John's Gospel before, but we were looking in this section in chapter 18, and we noted the literary style of John, the way he flashes scenes back and forth to give this contrast between the faithful witness, Jesus, who's being interrogated inside, and the unfaithful witness, Peter, out in the courtyard. But what we're going to look at this time is the way that Peter's slip into failure here is a progression. It starts slowly and gains momentum. So pick it up with me. If we can look at John 18 from verse 17, where Peter is challenged. You are not one of his disciples, are you? The girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. So it was cold. Now, that's not an unusual thing. It's Jerusalem, which is about 800 metres above sea level, and apparently spring nights could get pretty cold. Peter is cold, but it's also dark, and it's like John uses this all the way through the gospel. We've seen how he uses dark and light, night and day, with a moral connotation. Well, Peter is about to slip further into moral darkness as he responds to the questions. Now, the thing is, in the original Greek language, when you ask a question, there are little words. It's a little word. It's only 2 letters in Greek that allow you to explain the question as something where you're expecting a no answer. And there's another word to expect a yes answer, and it sets the. We do it in English. We don't have that provision in English language, but we do it through our tone of voice. Like you might be sitting there right now saying to yourself, this isn't going to be a long sermon, is it? You know, you wouldn't say that, but the expectation is you might be expecting, therefore, a no answer through the tone of your voice, right? Well, there's an actual word in the Greek language that expects a no answer, and it's in this sentence. So this first question of Peter is not as confronting and challenging as it could be. It's sort of like, you're not one of his disciples, are you? No. Easy for Peter to respond no to that because it's not put in a forceful way. So Peter, because he's not being forced into it, he's just casually trying to be expedient here, he wants to get in to see what's going on with Jesus. So this little white lie, is there such a thing as a white lie? A white lie he uses to just keep the peace here. But what we're seeing is, and what we're going to see is, that this lie, this first lie, progresses on to another lie, and it gets more and more to the point where it actually gets so aggressive that Matthew's gospel tells us he even brings down curses to deny Jesus. So there's a progression. This is how sin escalates in Peter's life, in our life. It's the way James in his epistle, James chapter 1 verse 14 describes it. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. You see, there's a progression. You let a little bit of something in, and it'll take you places you never thought possible. Starts out small, as it does with Peter, and you see the next progression down in the next section. Read with me from verse 25. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, you are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. This is the second time he's been challenged. So one lie leads to another. This time, the guy who's asking him is actually a relative of Malchus. Malchus was the guy that Peter, remember when the arrest happened and Jesus and the disciples were there, and Peter jumps forward with a sword and cuts off the ear of the Roman official. Well, the guy whose ear he cut off was his name Malchus, and the guy who's asking him this question now is a relative of Malchus. Malchus is already an assistant. He's got a position, an official position with a high priest. So this relative either has a high position or he's at least got connections. So if Peter tells the truth here, he knows he's in trouble. So again, be expedient. Save yourself here. Read it with me in verse 26. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? But Peter's going to deny it again. Lie gives birth to lie. Remember how we looked last time, if you can remember back, and this is where it's handy if you've got a Bible open, but we looked at the contrasting, the way that John has really masterfully put this together as a literary piece. He's got the meanwhile happening. He's got Jesus inside being interrogated and remaining faithful in his witness. In contrast, and it flashes back and forth, we've got Peter outside being the unfaithful witness, and it's kind of a meanwhile scene. That's why if you have got a Bible there, if you haven't, we'll just look at the headings of each section. So you have the first section, it starts in verse 12, where Jesus is arrested, taken into Annas' office. And so that's the faithful witness inside. And then down in verse 15, Peter's first denial is the NIV heading. And there it's Peter being the unfaithful witness outside. But then there's the flashback. Meanwhile, back inside, verse 19, the high priest questions Jesus. And then flashback again, verse 25. Peter's second and third denial, the unfaithful witness outside. And then, of course, it goes on to verse 28 when Jesus is again being the faithful witness before Pilate. You see John's writing style here. He's flashing scenes, one back to another. And what he's trying to do is to contrast the difference. That Jesus was inside, not only being a faithful witness. This is the thing we're going to notice this time, is Jesus is also protecting the disciples. Peter's out there giving Jesus up. No, don't know him. Whereas Jesus is inside actually protecting the disciples. Did you notice that when we read it? In verse 19, the first question that Annas asked Jesus is about his disciples. Verse 19, meanwhile the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. In other words, they were grilling him. They want to arrest the disciples too. Who are they? Who's that guy that cut off the ear of my official? Jesus will not give Peter up. Jesus will not give up his disciples. He protects his friends in the face of death outside. Peter gives it all up in a minute to protect himself. In fact, as we go on through this, as we read before, while Jesus protects his disciples, not giving them away, that's why they strike him in the face in verse 22. So verse 20, we see that Jesus is not only being a faithful witness, he's telling the truth to the whole world. Verse 20, I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews came together. I said nothing in secret. Whereas Peter, of course, keeps his little secret to protect himself. John Calvin said in this situation, he goes, Peter, the man who was ready to show his faith with a sword, was unable to keep it with his mouth. This is Peter. He thought he stood the test with the big confrontation with the sword. But as James in his epistle says in James 3 verse 8, but no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. The fascinating thing is, we know, Peter knew, that he was told in advance this was going to happen. Remember, he was told by Jesus, you will deny me 3 times. And of course he said that when Peter was boasting that he was going to lay down his life for Jesus. And when he said that to Jesus, how did Jesus respond? John chapter 13 verse 38. Then Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Peter is talking to. I tell you the truth. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Now this is where Peter is going, not me, no way. And after all, when those Romans came by, I took out my sword. I was ready to take on the whole army. And I cut that guy's ear off rather than give in. I'm ready to give my life. Now, of course, that's during the time that he had Jesus by his side. I think there's a little bit of, if you get a little bit of courage, if you had someone at your side who you'd already seen walk on water, you'd already seen perform miracles, even raise the dead, power over the very creation, the wind and the storm and everything. And this same one who had claimed, and Peter had heard him claim to be the I am, the God of the Old Testament, God himself with me, and Peter's bold and he's whipping out the sword and everything, but here he is on his own. Jesus is not there at that moment, and he ratted on Jesus. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? No. Curse, no. He disowned the Lord of glory. So what a chill it must have sent through Peter's heart when he hears the sound of the rooster piercing through the cold morning, announcing his treachery, just as Jesus had predicted. I'll lay down my life for you. The trouble is that Jesus had looked into Peter's black heart and said, no, you won't. You'll give me away. You'll disown me 3 times. The rooster announcing his treachery was also, the rooster announces the morning as a normal thing, that cock crow is the morning time. And in the ancient world, the clients would bring their legal matters to their patron at cockcrow. We know that also from the famed Roman writer Horace, who said this would happen first thing in the morning. So Pilate would normally start his work first thing right in the morning, where he would take legal matters and so on, be brought to him at cockcrow first thing in the morning. So this is the opportunity now for Annas, who's been grilling Jesus, to take him on to Caiaphas, who, remember, is the official high priest, even though Annas held that patriarchal role. And then they would be able to go straight on to Pilate. And that's, of course, what happened. But what's interesting for us is that it just happens that, remember, Jesus inside, Peter's outside the courtyard, and, it's morning. Hey, we can get action happening. We can take him to Caiaphas and then on to Pilate. So they bring out Jesus outside into the courtyard, and they must have been leading him right past Peter, right? And the cock crows, And what does Luke's gospel tell us? Jesus turned and looked straight at him. Oh, how that must have been such a shock for Peter. He thought it was all in hiding. He thought this little lie was just, these just little white lies, weren't they? Read with me Luke's version where he says in Luke 22 verse 61, the Lord turned right at that moment when the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him before the rooster crows today. You will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. He was cut to the heart. It had all seemed so practical. No one's looking, these people don't know me. I can get away with this. No one's seeing me. Few little white lies will keep me out of trouble. And I've been bold, wasn't I, ready to take up my sword and lay down my life? But I just get away with this little white lie. And in the end, it doesn't actually help Peter at all. All it gains him is tears and shame. And in the end, that's why we read from Numbers 32, verse 23, be sure your sin will find you out. There's no such thing as a secret little sin that is not going to be exposed at some point. Have you ever thought that where you think maybe you've got something, you're out in the courtyard, you've got something you think no one else knows about, and it goes unnoticed. How would anyone ever find out? And Jesus is not there at that moment, but he will be. Be sure your sin will find you out. Maybe it's something that's holding you back from truly committing your life to Jesus. And you think, I just got to have this and that's my secret part of my life. Be sure your sin will find you out. See, this courtyard can happen. Being in that outer courtyard can happen in any of us. You're someone who stands up for the Lord and resist temptation, but along comes a more subtle temptation. This was so much more subtle when they were getting arrested and they had the swords out. This is just a girl asking him, are you with him? Just that little, let that little slip, that little lie grows and grows. And we can find that. It might be a little something if I just tell a little lie here, or it'll be for the best, so I won't hurt that person. Or, at work, just a little something that says, I'll just keep that to myself and no one will know. That kind of thing. It can creep in our business or any kind of thing. And we do what Peter did. We say, oh, look, I've stood up for the Lord and that'll be okay. Let's let that go. And God knows my heart. God knows my heart. That's a popular one, isn't it? The unbelievers use that line a lot. Like, I'm going to stand before God. It's all right because God knows my heart. That's the problem. That's the problem. God does know your heart. God knew Peter's black heart and he knows our hearts. And there's a problem in the heart. That's what the problem is. Just like Peter. God knows your heart even before the rooster crows. You can be outside in the courtyard. You could be outside the wrong place, with friends egging you, come on in, it'll be all right, movie theatre, whatever. Outside, you can be outside of the internet and, that temptation to click where you shouldn't. No one knows. Be sure your sin will find you out. Maybe it's some of us like Peter. You have a chance to stand up for the Lord and you cop out, keep the peace. I'm a Christian who is ready to lay down my life. I'll take on the Roman army. The problem is, Christian, the Lord is not asking you to take on the Roman army. He's just asking you to be faithful with where He has placed you. Same thing, you children. You think, hey, Mum doesn't know what I'm up to here. Don't worry, God knows. And be sure your sin will find you out. When the rubber hits the road, Peter does really what Judas did. Judas betrayed Jesus. So did Peter. So did Peter. Even with curses. Let's not minimise what Peter did here. When was the last time you cursed to deny Jesus? This is serious what he's done. Peter is a complete failure here. All it's brought him is tears and shame, showing when it really comes down to it, when it's a choice between the Saviour and ourselves, we choose ourselves. And this is where we see that one little sin can lead you on a slippery slope. Should have fled at the first sign, the first sin. Should have confessed and repented of the first one. But it takes you places where you never thought possible. Now, Peter has done, really, what Judas did. What's the difference? They both denied, betrayed Jesus. Well, what the difference is that Judas failed. Peter failed, Judas failed, but Judas went on with it. Chucked in the towel. Went on with the sin the whole way. Whereas Peter comes back with tears of repentance. So we know that from later in this gospel. We'll get into that more. And for Peter, because he did repent, the failure, the sin, was not the end for him, but the beginning of something big. And as Peter goes on, and we'll see it through this gospel, and he comes to be confronted by the gospel, the cross and the resurrection of Christ. What Peter sees, and what we need to see when we sin against God, is didn't matter how hard I tried, how bold I thought I was going to be, how much I said I was going to do. Just like our vows today in membership that Fred and Marion took on, dependent on the Holy Spirit at every step. I'm dependent on the cross of Christ to take away my sin. I can't do this myself. That's the humiliation of the Christian faith. That's the humiliation that Peter goes through, that he might be lifted up to become a mighty servant for Jesus. See, it's really coming to know who you are. And I know that's a popular thought. Know yourself. Well, if you really know yourself, you know what's really inside. It's not a pretty sight. It's not a pretty sight. You wouldn't want your thoughts and your motives up on the screen for everybody to see. Know yourself. No, I don't want to know myself. Only to know that I'm a sinner in need of the cross of Christ. See, the trouble with know yourself is that God already knows what you're like. But the beautiful thing is that God saves ugly sinners who are repentant, like Peter. That's the difference. Despite who Peter is, it is by grace you are saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, not by works. It is a gift of God to give his Son for us. You know, people get so confused about, all the religions. It's not hard to figure this out. God, the true God's the only one who sent his Son for us. There is no other way, because there's no one offering a way to take away our sin. Why did God have to do that? Because he knew what was in our hearts, and he knew we could never get there ourselves. It is by grace you have been saved. So he provided the way through giving his own Son. Instead of Peter's failure being the end, it's the beginning. Luke 22 says Jesus says, after you've repented, after you've come back, strengthen your brothers. Peter goes on to become a leader of the Christian church. Here's this failure going on to great things. The message of Jesus dying on the cross for sinners is that those of us who fail and will fail can, through the humility and grace of God, return and still have great things to do in serving the Lord. Peter literally would have another opportunity to give his life. Tradition tells us that Peter was crucified for the faith. But when it came to that time of crucifixion, he requested to be crucified upside down, because he said, I'm not worthy to go the way my Lord did. In other words, Peter starts badly. We're reading it today, but he finishes well, humbling himself before the Lord. And like Peter, we too can know that the cross of Christ gives us another chance. You've got another chance. If you failed, you've got another chance. And if you fall over, well, let me close with a story about former Archbishop of Canterbury in England, way back in the 1500s. The Archbishop was Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer, who'd been Archbishop for Henry VIII, and then when Queen Mary came into power, she sought to return England to Roman Catholicism, and it was a horrible time of great persecution for those who stood for Christ and Christ alone. And Thomas Cranmer was one of those who preached Jesus as the way to heaven. And so he was brought before the burning stake to give his life. Or the alternative was they had a recantation written up for him to sign, to deny everything that he'd preached. If he signed that, he wouldn't have to go to the flames. He came to the flames and he saw the flames and he signed the recantation. He backed down. He failed. Broken. He still believed, but he didn't have the strength to stand up. He went back to preaching Christ and Christ alone. Again, Mary had him brought to the stake. And again, they had the recantation that he could sign and get out of the going to the flames if he would just sign. They expected him to sign again, but instead he proclaimed Christ and Christ alone, and then held out his right hand and said, this is the hand that did the evil in signing that first recantation. It must be punished first. And he put his hand in the fire to be burned first, before they then burned his whole body. And he died for Christ and Christ alone. Failed, but finished well. Any of us If you failed 100 times, you can get back up 100 times. Go back to Christ and find your salvation in Him, not how many times you failed. How do you know whether you're a Judas or a Peter? Not by whether you failed or not, but whether you'll get back up again and go back and confess and repent.